McGann is a financial planner with Claritude Financial Planning. G'day, Phil.
Hello, Kat. How are we going today?
I'm all right. I'm intrigued.
Intrigued?
I'm intrigued, Phil, by the case of this Australian woman who it seems has managed to argue that she should be able to claim the loss she made on the sale of her home.
Yes.
As a tax deduction.
Correct.
That's
very significant, and it goes and flies.
That's big.
It is big. It flies in the face of 40 years of tax situation in Australia. Your home is exempt from the capital gains tax regime because it's your principal place of residence. And so it's always been the case of you weren't getting taxed on any profit you made on the sale of a home, but you couldn't claim a loss as well. And so it was outside of that realm. What's happened here is something a bit particular, something a little bit different, and you have to unpack it a little bit to see why she got the result she did have.
Okay. All right. So let's walk through the story. What's going on?
Basically, the story is this. This individual, a few years ago now, probably 3 or 4 years ago, was buying, she was retiring and she wanted to buy an off-the-plan property, a unit, a lovely property in Sydney, and she bought it in a property that was yet to be built. So it's got a couple of years away. And she really liked the location, and then she saw there was another property in the development that was about to be completed, and she thought there'd be other people like me who'd like that property as well. Why don't I buy that one as well? I'll live in that while the other one's getting built, and then I'll flip it. I'll basically sell the first one and move into my dream apartment, making a profit, and so I'll be in front on the deal. Well, what happened was COVID happened. And basically during that period of time, she couldn't sell the property for what she actually paid for it. So she actually made a loss on the transaction, $265,000 loss with all the bibs and bobs in there. So basically she thought, well, I was actually trying to make a gain on this property, and I should actually then be able to claim the loss as a tax deduction, put it on a tax return. The ATO said, no. Come on, this is not the way
you were living in your home. That was your principal place of residence. You can't do that.
You can't do that. So they basically said, no, you can't do that. Her argument was that my main reason for doing it was trying to produce assessable income, and to actually produce that assessable income, I ended up with a loss, so I should be able to offset that loss against my other income. And the fact that I was living in the property was incidental. Now, she took the ATO to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, and she won.
Wow.
A few months ago.
Wow.
So it's sort of sitting there in limbo a little bit at the present time. The ATO has come out and said, we're looking at all avenues. From the ATO's point of view, if they go and appeal this to the federal court. Now, I'm not a solicitor. I'm not sort of giving legal opinion here. But effectively, if they went to the federal court and appealed this and won, well, they could literally, everything goes back to normal in her scenario. But if they sat on it and said, well, we'll allow her deduction, but by the same token, potentially any capital gains on properties out there is assessable. Now, is that going to happen? It seems like it's a very narrow definition and individual case involved here because of what she was trying to achieve. But it opens up a lot of can of worms about a lot of other things as well.
Especially at a time when property is just such a hot button issue.
Yes.
You know, look at the housing crisis, look at concerns around negative gearing, around some of the other instruments that have facilitated the market that we live in today. What I also think is interesting to consider as part of this, Phil, is the way that other slightly comparable jurisdictions handle property and tax, and the family home and tax.
The interesting thing is we're a little bit unusual in Australia about taxing the family home or not taxing it. In other comparable countries, in New Zealand, there's an intent question. You've got to, when you lodge your tax return, if you've made a gain on the sale of a property, the taxation office in New Zealand will look at what was your intention on buying that property. Did you have an intention to actually make a profit on the property, and potentially you're up for tax on that? But if you bought it 20 years ago as a family home and raising children and things like that, maybe not. So the intention is really the issue. And if you go back to this potential case, it appears that her intention was not to live in the property as such, was to make a profit on it. That's why she was looking at it that way. It's different. It's something that's potentially turning everything on its head a little bit.
in the United States of America, tax on your principal place of residence is pretty standard fare.
It is, but they do have a certain thresholds as well that are quite high about the gains you have. But also some of the interest or some of the expenses is claimable on your tax as well. So some people would say here in Australia, well, if we start taxing the capital gains on my home, I should be able to get an interest deduction for all the mortgage repayments I'm making. Well, it doesn't really work that way, because the reason you've got a negatively geared property is if you're renting a property out and you incur rental or gain rental income, that is an income that you have to pay tax on. You incurred a debt, interest expense on that debt to actually earn that income. So you're claiming one against the other, and that's how the negative gearing works. You've got no income coming from your own home. That's the difference here. So you can't literally say, well, I should claim the interest on my mortgage as a deduction against potentially any gains. They're two different taxes.
It's so interesting too then when you consider, as we outlined, people who might purchase a property and live in it, but live in it with the intention of flipping it, and it might take some time, but you're spending money on the renovation, and you're...
And just to unpack that, I mean, a lot of people have heard of this. I mean, people are serial flippers, so to speak. They'll actually buy a property, move into it, renovate around themselves for a couple of years, and then they'll sell the property and move on to the next one. They don't pay any capital gains tax because it's their principal place of residence. All of those expenses are you don't incur that gains tax. Now, should that be the case? This is where this sort of case may well start to unravel some of that. Potentially, yeah. We don't know yet, but it certainly does get you thinking. My name's Kat, Phil McGann with you on ABC Radio Brisbane and Queensland. Trudy at Arana Hills, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's a different story altogether if someone's been renting it out and living in another house because it's not their principal place of residence. But if they've been living in the house and then they sell it to buy another dwelling, whatever type, it definitely shouldn't be taxed. How are they going to work out how much profit? If you've had the house for 20 or 30 years, what are they going to base the value on?
Correct. And that'd be a really complicated scenario in trying to keep track of records and all the rest for a property you've lived in for many, many years. So it's a practicalities of this sort of tax as well that would cause it to trip up a little bit too. And I always think that I think it'd be very unusual for a government to let something like this come in by the back door and they'd be forced to make the statement on it to actually rule it out.
Anthony at Chambers Flat, thank you, Trudy. Anthony says, hi, Kat. Does that mean I get to claim all the interest I pay on my family home loan as a deduction?
Well, look, again, I wouldn't think so because of the fact that the capital gains tax and income tax are different things. You can offset a loss on a gain. What this lady was doing was she was saying that this was accessible income I was trying to achieve. And it's not the same thing that you're just buying your family home, so to speak, and you can claim the deductions. Look, it's unravelling everything else, and it goes to the crux of housing as an asset or housing as a home.
Yes,
that sort of thing.
Yes,
that's a problem.
Phil McGann, financial planner with you on ABC Radio Brisbane and Queensland. My name's Kat. It's 5 minutes to 3. As you said, Phil, it's now kind of in limbo, this particular case.
True.
And I think it's definitely something to consider. Certainly fuel for the next conversation at the barbecue over the weekend, no doubt, when house prices come up, as they tend to.
As they tend to in Australia. It's a national pastime talking about house prices and all the rest of it. Look, it's an interesting take on things, and it's really thrown a lot of people in the industry out of kilter, saying, well, what does this really mean? So the ATOs is sitting on their hands at the present time, from what I gather. So again, there's no reason for people to go and do anything or worry about anything. It's just an interesting thing to be talking about.
Keep your eyes and ears peeled. Phil, thank you very much for your time.
No problems, Kat.